Apple is rumored to be hosting a January event. Okay, so you probably have two questions. Why January, as it's always been March, June, or September? And what could we actually see at this potential event? So to answer the first question, why January, this is coming from Ming-Chi Kuo, and according to a June report that he published, January 2023 would be when Apple would be unveiling the mixed reality headset that's been in the works for such a long time, and they would be hosting a separate event just for this. So yeah, January might seem a bit weird, until you remember that the very first iPhone was announced in January the 9th to be more exact, and then released in June. So this is rumored to be the case with this headset, an early unveil and then a later release. Although personally, I don't actually think that we're going to have a January event, and that's because well, no one else has reported on this aside from Ming-Chi Kuo. And on top of this, Ming-Chi Kuo has just reported that their headset has actually been delayed from the second quarter of 2023 to the second half of 2023. So the original plan was an announcement in January and then a release in June at WWDC. But if this release is going to be delayed until September or even later, then I also think that the announcement would be delayed as well. So my guess is that instead of January, Apple will have an early 2023 event, likely in March like before, at which they would also unveil this new headset. So in that case, what else could we see from this event? Number one, we have the new HomePod. Yes, a brand new HomePod is apparently coming, according to Ming-Chi Kuo and Mark Gurman. Ming-Chi Kuo gave us a date of late 2022 or early 2023 for this new HomePod. There's not actually going to be a lot of innovation expected in terms of the hardware design, according to Ming-Chi Kuo. In fact, Mark Gurman claims that this new version would be an in-between size of the original HomePod and the HomePod Mini. But here's something probably more interesting. Mark reported a while ago that Apple was also working on a HomePod with a screen and the camera to compete with Google's Nest Hub or the Amazon Echo Show. Now, this is something that I'm really excited to see, something that's more than, just an updated version of the old HomePod. Okay, the second thing to expect from this early 2023 event are the new MacBooks. So finally, the 14 and the 16-inch MacBook Pros updated with the M2 Pro and the M2 Max chips. And I have some good news, I do actually have some fresh new leaks on these for you. So a couple of weeks ago, we saw the very first Geekbench leaks of the M2 Max chip. And this actually scored 1,853 single core, up from 1,777. So that was a 4.2% higher score, which was, yes, a very small improvement. Now, the multi-core was a bit better. So 13,855 up from 12,720. So that was 9% higher. An okay improvement. Well, the interesting news here is that we now have a second round of scores that just got leaked, and this one is actually much higher than the first. So in this one, we have 2,027 points for the single core, and that is 14% higher than the M1 Max, rather than just 4.2% like in the initial leak. And the multi-core was also quite a bit higher, 14,888, or 17% higher as opposed to just 9% in the previous leak. So these are some way bigger gains than I previously expected. Also, you need to remember that this is going to be based on a 3nm process, both the M2 Max and the M2 Pro, which means that these chips will be more efficient and we would also very likely see an improved battery life. But wait, Daniel, how is that even possible when we actually have more cores? So 2 extra CPU cores on the unbinned models and up to 6 extra GPU cores on the unbinned M2 Max models. However, those 2 extra CPU cores are actually said to be efficiency cores rather than performance cores. On the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, we have 10 cores in total, 8 performance to efficiency. And on the M2 Pro and M2 Max, we're set to get 12, so 8 performance, and in this case, 4 efficiency. And those 4 efficiency cores should give us much better battery life on the 14 and 16-inch models. As right now, those high performance cores have to be used way more often than they should be. And this is why there is such a major battery life difference between the M1 Pro, M1 Max chips, and the standard M1. For example, with my 14-inch MacBook Pro, and I mentioned this in multiple videos before, I'm getting about 4 to 5 hours on average of battery life, which means that I always need to carry my charger with me. Now, I recently bought an M1 MacBook Air for our collection, which I've also been using quite a bit too, and honestly, I'm getting like easily 12 plus hours on that thing. Absolutely insane. So yeah, I cannot wait for this level of battery life to come to the new 16 and 14-inch models. And I think that this is 100% doable with these new efficiency cores. Another piece of news, in the Steam database, 2 unreleased Mac models were spotted. Mac 14.6 and Mac 15.4 as the identifiers. By the way, Mac 14.6 doesn't necessarily mean that this is the 14-inch model. If we take a look at the current model numbers, the 14-inch has Mac 18.3 and 18.4, whereas the 16-inch has Mac 18.1 and 18.2. And since these numbers were very close together, in our case, with a Steam database leak, I think that those two Macs are actually two very different Macs. Apple's latest MacBooks from 2022, so the M2 Air and the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro, use Mac 14.2 and Mac 14.7 as the identifiers, which makes me think that Mac 14.6 is actually a MacBook, whereas the other identifier, 15.4, could be a Mac Studio, which is the second thing to expect from this event. Now, with this new Mac Studio, we would have two chip options, the M2 Max and the M2 Ultra. Now, here's something else that's quite interesting. If we take a look at these two Geekbench leaks that we've seen before, the model identifier is 14.6 once again, which I assume to be a 16-inch MacBook Pro. But then if we take a look at the memory, this is listed as 96 gigabytes of RAM, which could mean two things. Either this is a MacBook Pro with 96 gigabytes of RAM, or this is a Mac Studio with 96 gigabytes of RAM, which does seem more likely considering that the previous Mac Studio supported up to 128. But then you need to remember that both of these Geekbench leaks were actually the M2 Max chip and not the M2 Ultra, which means that we would very likely see 96 gigabytes of RAM on both the MacBook Pros and the new Mac Studio. Now, although some people might actually benefit from 96 gigabytes of RAM, when we did our Mac Studio testing, there wasn't that much of a difference in real-world usage between 32 and 64, which actually made me think of the following theory. If we take a look at the M2 chip, the highest amount of RAM is 24 gigabytes, which is a bit strange, as, you know, that used to be double of the lower-end model, so double of 16, which would have been 32. Now, if you double 24, you get 48, and if you double that, you get 96. So what I'm saying is that based on those Geekbench leaks that show 96 gigabytes of RAM and the fact that the M2 chip supports 24, I believe these to be the following RAM options for the new M2 Max chips, which would be some very, very good upgrades. 32 gigabytes was already ideal for most people, but the fact that now this is being bumped to 48 would be so awesome for future proofing. Now, something else that I've noticed when it came to those Geekbench leaks is that the original had a clock speed of 3.54. But the new one had a clock speed of 3.68. Now, of course, if this was early testing, Apple could have simply just adjusted the clock speeds. But I think that this is quite unlikely considering the amount of rumors that we saw that these MacBook Pros were ready to release. So I think that these chips are actually finalized and have been so for a while. So my guess here is that a higher clock speed version was actually the one inside the Mac Studio, even though the model number was the same, so there was probably some sort of error there, but that to me makes more sense than the clock speeds being increased in like a few days. In fact, even now, if you take a look at the MacBook Pro's clock speeds and the Mac Studio, we have 3.15 on the M1 Max MacBook Pros compared to 3.22 on the Mac Studio. So they did this in the past, and they would likely increase and have differences in terms of the clock speeds once again. And then, of course, we also have the M2 Ultra model of the Mac Studio, which hasn't yet been leaked, and this would be double the M2 Max in every single way, which means 24 CPU cores up from 20 with up to a 20% CPU improvement, 76 GPU cores from the 64 and the M1 Ultra, so up to 18% improvement, and 192 gigabytes of RAM from 128 on the M1 Ultra, which is 50% more maximum RAM. M2 Ultra Mac Studio, who even needs a Mac Pro at this point, am I right? But I think the best part is that you'll be able to find some great deals on the M1 Ultra Mac Studio and the M1 Max Mac Studio, and you can tap on the YouTube Shop cards below for some great choices. And at number 4, of course, we have the Apple Mixed Reality headset. So if we don't actually see any January announcement, like I said, it will likely be March, unless the release is actually pushed into December, which would mean that the announcement would only happen at WWDC. And in terms of just the announcement, this would be a software unveil, so XROS, and likely a hardware reveal too, with all the features and all the functionality to create hype for the release, which would be 6 months or so later. And as I mentioned before, this headset would feature both AR and VR support for Apple services, a super high resolution display, the M2 chip, and overall this would be the most powerful and the most advanced headset on the market. You can check out our separate video just on this right here. What are you excited for the most? I'm Daniel, this is ZONEofTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.